Before the first temples rose, before kings claimed the favour of heaven, and before any god had a written name, humans were already stepping into darkness with fire in their hands, on cave walls, in burial pits, beside ancient springs, and beneath the silent stars. They left traces of powers we may never fully understand. Were these the first gods, or something even older than gods? Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, deep inside the cave, where daylight has already died behind stone, the walls begin to move, not because the rock itself is alive, but because the flame is unsteady. A small fire, carried in a hollow of bone or a lamp of fat, trembles in the hand of someone standing far beyond the reach of the ordinary world. The light crawls across limestone, disappears into cracks, returns along the curve of a painted back, and suddenly an animal seems to breathe. A bison lowers its head. A horse appears to step out of darkness. A lion, drawn with a confidence that still feels startling after tens of thousands of years, waits with its muzzle pointed towards some unseen prey. The person holding the light does not see these images the way a museum visitor sees them today. There is no label, no glass barrier, no quiet explanation printed on a wall. There is only cold air, smoke, darkness, stone, and the feeling that something powerful has been summoned. Long before temples rise above river valleys, before priests write hymns to named gods, before kings claim that heaven has chosen them, human beings are already entering places where the world seems to change its rules. The cave is not simply a shelter. Many painted chambers lie deep underground, far from living areas, beyond narrow passages that require crawling, climbing, and deliberate effort. Some are difficult to reach even with modern lights. That matters. It suggests that at least some of these spaces are not decorated homes, not casual galleries, not idle marks left by bored hunters waiting for better weather. They are destinations. People go there on purpose. They carry light into darkness, and in that darkness they leave signs that still disturb the imagination. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because this story begins in a time when almost everything that mattered was spoken, sung, gestured, remembered, and then lost. No scripture survives from the Ice Age. No myth has come down to us in the voices of the people who painted these animals. No one wrote the name of the power they feared, loved, fed, or followed. What remains is stranger and more fragile. Mineral pigment ground from earth, charcoal blown or brushed onto stone, handprints pressed against walls, broken lamps, footprints in clay, and the long silence of rooms that may have once held ritual. The temptation is to call these images gods, but that word may arrive too heavily loaded with later ideas. A god, in the world of cities, often has a name, a family, a statue, a shrine, a priesthood, a calendar of offerings, a story of birth and battle. In these caves, there are no such certainties. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate what the images meant. Some see hunting magic, the hope that painting an animal might help bring it within range of a spear. Some see initiation, a journey into darkness where young people learn the hidden knowledge of their group. Some see visions produced by trance, hunger, rhythm, fear, and flickering light. Some see memory maps, mythic scenes, clan symbols, or encounters with beings that were not yet gods in the later sense, but were more than animals in the ordinary sense. What survives in the record suggests that early humans were not simply copying the world around them. They selected, emphasized, and transformed it. In many famous painted caves, the animals shown are not always the animals most commonly eaten. Horses, bison, aurochs, mammoths, lions, bears, rhinoceroses, and other powerful creatures dominate the walls in ways that do not neatly match a dinner menu. Small animals, plants, landscapes, rivers, huts, and everyday tools are often absent or rare. The cave artists focus on bodies of strength, danger, abundance, and mystery. They draw animals that can feed a group, crush a person, vanish across open country, return with the seasons, or stare from the edge of firelight with eyes that seem to know something humans do not. There is an intelligence in the way the walls are used. A bulge in the stone becomes the shoulder of a beast, a crack becomes a wound, a boundary, or the dark line of a back. Natural hollows become eyes or mouths. The cave is not treated as a blank surface. It is treated as a place already filled with forms, as if the animals were half hidden inside the rock, and the painter's task was not to invent them, but to release them. This detail is easy to miss in photographs. Where cave art becomes flattened into an image, inside the chamber, with flame shifting over uneven stone, the effect can be almost animate. The animal appears, disappears, and appears again. It is not hard to understand why some researchers have suggested that these spaces were experienced as thresholds between the visible and the invisible. And yet caution is necessary. Modern people are skilled at making prehistoric people either too simple or too familiar. They were not primitive children frightened by every shadow, and they were not modern mystics wearing Ice Age clothing. They were human beings with minds as complex as ours, living in worlds of extreme attention. They knew animal tracks in mud, the direction of wind over snow, the smell of wet hide, the danger of a broken season, the sound of a predator beyond the fire. Their survival depended on reading signs, and their inner lives likely depended on signs as well. A footprint was not just a footprint. A migration path was not just movement. A cave was not just geology. In a world without writing, meaning lived in places, gestures, scars, pigments, bones, songs, and repeated acts. The darkness itself may have mattered. To enter a deep cave is to leave behind the daily sky. The outside world has weather, birds, sun, voices, and open distance. The inner cave has echo, breath, dripping water, mineral smell, and a darkness so complete that the body begins to doubt its own edges. A hand lifted before the face disappears unless flame touches it. Sound bends strangely. A footstep can seem to come from somewhere else. Smoke gathers and moves like a living thing. Under such conditions, a painted animal is not merely seen, it is encountered. The wall becomes a boundary, and the boundary feels thin. This may be one of the oldest roots of religion, not belief as a written doctrine, but encounter as an experience. The sense that the world contains presences, the feeling that certain places are charged, the conviction that animals, ancestors, storms, caves, and night are not empty mechanisms but participants in life. The forgotten gods worshipped before history began may not have begun as seated figures on thrones. They may have begun as a bison emerging in firelight, a bear skull placed carefully in a chamber, a handprint left beside an animal's flank, a silence held by a group of people who knew that ordinary speech did not belong there. The handprints are especially haunting. Some are made by pressing a pigment-covered palm against stone. Others are created by placing the hand on the wall and blowing pigment around it, leaving a pale human shape surrounded by colour. Across thousands of years, the gesture remains instantly recognizable. The hand says, in the simplest possible way, someone was here, but perhaps it said more than that. It may have marked presence, belonging, passage, transformation, or contact with the unseen. We cannot know the exact meaning. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Still, the emotional force of the image survives. A human hand reaches across deep time, not holding a tool, not striking prey, not building shelter, but touching the skin of the earth. In that touch lies the beginning of the mystery. Before history gives the gods names, before myth arranges them into families, before empires build temples and demand sacrifices, something older is already happening in the dark. People are gathering where the stone seems alive. They are painting creatures larger than themselves. They're carrying fire into the earth and leaving marks where no practical need required them. They are making the invisible visible, or trying to. And though the exact gods are forgotten, the impulse behind them has not vanished. It waits in the cave, in the flame, in the animal that seems to breathe when the light moves. Outside the cave, the same mystery does not disappear. It spreads across the entire world. The people who leave those marks in darkness do not step back into a landscape of neutral objects. They step into a living field of signs. The wind is not an abstract movement of air. It carries weather, scent, warning, and memory. A river is not simply water moving downhill. It gives fish, blocks passage, swells without permission, drowns the careless, reveals stones, hides bodies, and changes its voice with the season. A mountain is not a pile of rock. It watches from the horizon, catches clouds, marks direction, holds snow, and stands long after generations of people have died. In such a world, presence is not a poetic idea. It is part of survival. For early humans, attention is a form of life insurance. A broken twig, a sudden silence among birds, a shift in the smell of the air, the angle of vultures circling in the distance, the freshness of dung, the softness of mud near a waterhole. All of these can matter. The landscape speaks constantly, though not in words. It gives clues to those who know how to listen. Over thousands of years, this intense attention may help create a world in which animals, places, and forces seem to possess intention. Scholars still debate how far we can go in reconstructing prehistoric belief, but what survives in later hunter-gatherer traditions suggests that many human societies did not sharply divide nature from spirit in the way modern industrial culture often does. Forest, river, ancestor, animal, dream, and weather could overlap in ways that felt perfectly ordinary. The forgotten gods before history may have begun in that overlap, not as distant rulers sitting beyond the sky, but as powers encountered within the immediate world. The storm that breaks a drought is not just useful, it is overwhelming. Thunder rolls across open land like a voice too large for any throat. Lightning splits a tree and leaves the air smelling sharp and burnt. Rain turns dust into scent, fills hollows, softens seeds, brings insects, and changes the movement of animals. It is easy to imagine why people might treat the storm as a force with mood, hunger, anger, or generosity. This does not mean they believed exactly as later peoples believed. The evidence remains incomplete. But the path from awe to offering, from fear to ritual, from pattern to personality, is not difficult to trace. Night adds another layer. In deep prehistory, darkness is not merely the absence of light, it is an environment with its own rules. Beyond the fire, familiar ground becomes uncertain. Human eyes weaken, other eyes strengthen. Hyenas, lions, wolves, bears, leopards, and other predators belong to the hours when people cluster together and listen. The fire creates a small human island, bright enough for faces and hands, too weak to conquer the surrounding dark. Around that island, stories can grow. A sound in the distance may be an animal, a falling branch, a shifting stone, or something remembered from a dream. What cannot be seen is not empty, it is full. Dreams may have been among the most powerful engines of sacred imagination. Every night, people vanish into private worlds where the dead can return. Animals can speak without mouths. The body can fly. The lost can be found. And impossible things can feel true until waking. To a modern mind trained to classify dreams as brain activity, this may seem explainable, though still strange. To people without that framework, Dreams may have offered evidence that the self could travel, that the dead were not entirely gone, that animals had hidden forms, and that a second world existed alongside the waking one. No single explanation fully accounts for the birth of religious thought, but dreams are almost certainly part of the story. They give humans repeated experience of an invisible reality that feels vivid, emotional, and sometimes prophetic. Death makes the invisible harder to ignore. A living person breathes, speaks, remembers, desires, and responds. Then something changes, and the body remains, but the person is absent. That absence is one of the oldest mysteries human beings face. Where did the person go? Why does the body look familiar yet no longer answer? Why do the dead appear in dreams? Why does grief make them seem close in certain places, especially where they lived, slept, worked, or were buried long before theology? Death creates a question that cannot be solved by toolmaking alone. The world now contains not only animals and weather, but absence with a human shape. The earlier spiritual worlds may have been crowded not because people invented fantasies, but because experience itself was crowded. A hunter sees a herd return each year along the same path. A child hears elders speak of a person who died before the child was born, yet whose decisions still shape the group. A storm arrives after days of ritual concern. A healer uses plants whose effects seem almost miraculous when pain eases or fever breaks. A person dreams of an animal and finds its tracks the next day. Coincidence, memory, pattern, fear, and hope begin to braid together. Some meanings are tested by survival, others are strengthened by repetition. Over time, certain places, creatures, seasons, and gestures gather weight. This is not ignorance, it is a different arrangement of knowledge. Prehistoric people understand their environments in ways many modern people would struggle to match. They know which roots poison, which berries nourish, which stones fracture into blades, which wood burns hot, which bones can be shaped, which stars return with cold weather, which birds signal nearby water. Yet practical knowledge does not cancel sacred interpretation. The same animal can be meat, danger, teacher, ancestor, symbol, and spirit. The same river can be drinking water, boundary, path, burial place, and living presence. What modern categories separate, ancient experience may have held together. One lesser-known clue comes from the way humans repeatedly mark difficult, liminal places, cave mouths, cliffs, springs, river crossings, unusual stones, and high viewpoints. Even in much later periods, such places attract ritual attention because they feel like thresholds. Water emerges from underground, echoes answer from rock, mist rises from marsh, birds cross between earth and sky, serpents vanish into holes and return. The world seems to open, close, breathe, or speak. It is possible that long before formal pantheons, these threshold places were already treated with care, caution, and ceremony. The sacred, then, may not begin with belief in a god above the world. It may begin with the refusal to see the world as dead. In the minds of people living close to danger and dependence, the world is active. It gives and takes. It remembers through tracks, bones, scars, seasons, and stories. It answers sometimes, refuses often, and punishes mistakes without explaining itself. To live in such a world is to negotiate constantly with visible and invisible forces. Some can be touched. Some can only be sensed. Some appear in dreams, storms, animals, caves, or the face of the dead. And so the forgotten gods remain unnamed, but not unimaginable. They are the force in the river bend where offerings may one day be left. They are the presence in a bear's den, the warning in thunder, the breath of wind over grass, the memory of an ancestor near the hearth, the animal shape flickering in the mind before sleep. Before history begins, humanity does not live in an empty universe waiting to be explained. It lives in a world already thick with meaning. The living world is full of signs. but the dead create a sign unlike any other. A storm passes, a river floods and then falls. A herd moves beyond the ridge and may return with the season. But a dead person remains in a way that is both unmistakable and impossible to accept. The body is still there, the face may still be known, the hands may still carry scars from work, hunting, birth, injury, or craft. Yet the voice is gone, the breath is gone, the warmth leaves. The person who laughed, remembered, feared, desired, and belonged to others has become silent matter. For early humans, as for humans now, this is not merely a biological event. It is a rupture in the shape of the world. Some of the oldest clues to sacred imagination are not painted on cave walls but placed with the dead. Burials are among the most intimate archaeological evidence because they show not only that someone died, but that someone else responded. A body left by accident, covered by flood, or taken by scavengers tells one kind of story. A body arranged, protected, coloured, accompanied, or returned to again tells another. It suggests time spent after death, effort given to someone who can no longer repay it, and perhaps a belief that the dead still mattered in ways that went beyond memory. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact meaning of early burials. But the repeated care given to bodies across different prehistoric contexts makes one thing difficult to ignore. Death was not always treated as simple disposal. Red ochre appears again and again in ancient burial contexts, and its presence is one of the most haunting details in the deep record. This iron-rich pigment, ground from earth and stone, can stain bone, skin, shell, and soil with a colour that resembles blood, sunset, rust, and warmth. In some burials, ochre is scattered around the body. In others, it appears in patches, as if placed deliberately. It may have symbolised blood, life, rebirth, transformation, protection, or identity. Or it may have held meanings that no modern category captures. No single explanation fully accounts for its use across such wide distances and time spans. Yet the choice to colour the dead with red earth suggests that the body was being changed, marked, or prepared for a condition beyond ordinary decay. Grave goods deepen the mystery. Beads, shells, tools, animal bones, antlers, ornaments, and other objects sometimes accompany the dead. A stone tool placed near a hand may be practical, symbolic, personal, or ceremonial. A necklace of shells may speak of beauty, status, group identity, exchange networks, or mourning. Animal remains may represent food, offerings, companions, powers, or memories of a hunt. In later societies, grave goods often point toward belief in an afterlife. But it would be too simple to project later ideas straight into prehistory. What survives in the record suggests care and meaning, not a complete theology. Still, when the living place objects with the dead, they act as though death has not ended relationship. That may be the key. Before gods are imagined as distant cosmic beings, the first unseen powers may have been the dead who stayed near. Ancestors do not need temples to become sacred. They need memory, place, and repetition. A child grows up hearing of a grandmother who knew the old migration path, a hunter whose courage saved others, a healer whose knowledge of roots and fever is still remembered, a person whose mistake brought danger, hunger, or shame. The dead shape decisions long after their bodies are gone. Their names may be spoken beside fires. Their stories may warn, guide, comfort, or accuse. Over generations, memory can thicken into presence. The ancestor becomes more than a remembered person. The ancestor becomes part of the moral weather of the group. Burial places make that presence physical. A grave marks a location where the living can return. Even if early groups moved often, certain places may have held the dead like anchors in a changing landscape. A camp may be abandoned, a river crossed, a herd followed, but the burial remains. To come back to such a place is to meet time itself. The living stand above those who walked before them. They may leave objects, repair coverings, add new bodies, or simply remember. Archaeology can rarely tell us whether a whispered story, song, or ritual took place there, but it can show that some locations were revisited. The dead, in this sense, do not vanish into abstraction. They occupy ground. One surprising detail in the study of prehistoric burial is how varied death treatment can be. Some bodies are carefully placed in flexed positions, knees drawn close, as if sleeping, crouching, or returning to a womb-like posture. Others are extended. Some are buried alone, others with companions. Some skulls appear to have been removed, curated, or treated separately in later prehistoric contexts. In certain Neolithic communities, skulls were plastered and shaped with remarkable care, with shells sometimes used for eyes. These examples belong to later periods than the earliest Ice Age burials, but they reveal a long human tendency to treat the head and face as powerful containers of identity. The face is where recognition lives. To preserve, reshape, or display it is to keep the dead in social life. This does not mean every ancient burial was religious in the same way. Practical concerns mattered too. Bodies attract scavengers, smell, and disease. Burial can protect the living as well as honour the dead. But practicality and sacred meaning are not opposites. The same act can solve a problem and express a belief. Covering a body with earth may prevent animals from tearing it apart, but arranging the limbs, adding pigment, including ornaments, or choosing a special place adds layers that go beyond disposal. The living are not merely removing a corpse from camp, they are managing a transformation. The transformation is terrible because it is visible. Flesh changes, colour changes. The familiar becomes unfamiliar. People living close to death would understand decay with a clarity modern life often hides. They would know the smell of blood, the stillness after injury, the speed with which insects find a body, the way bones emerge after time. Perhaps this made the question of the person more urgent, not less. If the body breaks apart, where does the one who dreamed and remembered go? If the dead appear in dreams, do they visit if a burial is disturbed and misfortune follows? Is the dead person angry? If a hunt succeeds after offerings are made at a grave, has an ancestor helped? The evidence cannot answer these questions directly, but human imagination almost certainly asked them. From this soil, the first ancestor powers may have grown. Not gods with crowns or thunderbolts, but the near dead, the ones under the floor, beyond the camp, in the cave, beside the river, beneath stones, inside memory. Their power may have been protective, dangerous, or both. Ancestors can bless continuity, but they can also demand obedience to old ways. They connect a group to land, lineage, skill, and identity. In a world where survival depends on inherited knowledge, the dead are not useless. They are the source of what the living know. And so the forgotten gods worshipped before history began may have had human faces before they had divine ones. They may have looked like the people whose bones were painted red, whose beads were laid beside them, whose skulls were kept close, whose graves became places of return. The sacred may have begun not only in fear of storms or awe before animals, but in grief. A hand lowers ochre onto a body. A tool is placed where fingers once closed. Earth covers the face. The living step away. But not completely. Something remains near them, silent and powerful, waiting to be remembered. The dead may have stayed near, but the animals stood everywhere. They moved through the outer dark, across frozen plains, beside rivers, through forests, over grasslands that stretched farther than a person could walk in a day. They filled the world with hunger, meat, danger, tracks, hides, bones, fat, sound, and motion. To prehistoric people, animals were not background life. They were neighbours, rivals, prey, teachers, enemies, weather signs, and sometimes beings whose power seemed to exceed the human body so completely that ordinary language may not have been enough. Long before a god was imagined with a human face, The sacred may have worn horns, claws, feathers, tusks, scales, or the heavy shoulders of a beast half seen in smoke. The Ice Age world was crowded with animals that could humble any human confidence. Mammoths moved like living hills, their tusks curving through cold air, their feet pressing deep into mud and snow. Woolly rhinoceroses carried strength in a form both massive and unpredictable. Cave lions, larger than modern lions in some cases, hunted across open landscapes where a person without fire, weapons, and companions would be terribly vulnerable. Bears occupied caves, slept through seasons, left bones and claw marks in the very darkness where humans sometimes painted. Bison and aurochs gathered the force of muscle, horn, and herd, reindeer, horses, ibex, birds, serpents, fish, and countless smaller creatures shaped daily life in ways that were practical, emotional, and perhaps spiritual all at once. It is difficult today to feel the full weight of that dependence. Modern people can look at animals through screens, fences, books, and controlled encounters. For Ice Age hunters and gatherers, animals were the difference between life and hunger. A successful kill could mean marrow, meat, hide, sinew, bone tools, warmth, shelter, ornaments, and social celebration. A failed hunt could mean weakness spreading through a group. A wounded animal could kill. A vanished herd could force movement. A predator could take a child at the edge of camp. Animals gave life, but they never gave it simply. Their gifts had to be risked for, tracked, remembered, and sometimes paid for in blood. This may explain why animal images dominate so much early symbolic life. In cave art, portable carvings, bone engravings, and later ritual objects. The animal body is not merely copied, it is studied, emphasized, and sometimes transformed. The curve of a horse's belly, the tension in a bison's neck, the posture of a lion, the lifted head of a stag, the heavy line of a mammoth's back. These are drawn by people who know animals intimately. They know how bodies move because they have followed them across real landscapes. They know the difference between a relaxed animal and one about to bolt. They understand muscle under hide, weight in the shoulders, and the importance of a head lowered at the wrong moment. This is art, but it is also attention sharpened by need. And yet need alone does not explain everything. Some animals that appear in prehistoric imagery were dangerous rather than commonly hunted. Lions, bears, rhinoceroses, and other formidable creatures may not have been ordinary food sources in many regions, yet they held a powerful place in the imagination. Scholars still debate whether these images represent mythic beings, clan identities, hunting rituals, visionary experiences, teaching scenes, or something else. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single interpretation fits every site. But the repeated focus on powerful animals suggests that prehistoric people were not simply drawing what they ate, they were engaging with what possessed force. Bears are especially suggestive. They share caves with humans, though not always at the same time, and their bones appear in many deep cave contexts. A bear can stand upright in a way that feels disturbingly human. It has paws that can almost resemble hands, a face capable of expression, a winter disappearance that resembles death, and a spring return that resembles rebirth. Later cultures across the northern world often treat bears with ritual caution, respect, or kinship. Though it would be unsafe to assume those later beliefs directly explain Ice Age practices. Still, the animal itself invites unusual thought. A creature that sleeps in the earth, emerges after the cold, kills with terrifying power, and seems almost like a fur-covered relative could easily become more than an animal in human imagination. Birds offered another kind of mystery. They moved between earth and sky, crossed distances humans could only watch, appeared and vanished with the seasons, and sometimes fed on the dead. Vultures, ravens, eagles, owls, cranes, and water birds all carry symbolic force in later traditions, and their natural behaviours may help explain why. A bird rising from a carcass seems to carry something upward. A migratory flock seems to know invisible roads through the air. An owl calling at night turns darkness into a voice. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric people noticed birds not only as food or feathers, but as beings crossing boundaries humans could not cross. In a world already thick with signs, flight itself may have felt like knowledge. Serpents and snake-like forms may have drawn power from a different boundary. They move without legs, vanish into holes, shed their skins, strike suddenly, and return from hidden places in the earth. Their bodies seem simple and uncanny at the same time. A snake can be a danger, a healer's sign, a water symbol, an earth spirit, or a figure of renewal in later cultures. For deep prehistory, certainty is impossible. But the natural strangeness of serpents would have been obvious to any human watching one slip silently through grass, rock, or water. The sacred often begins where ordinary categories fail, and snakes fail several categories at once. The mammoth, however, may have carried the grandeur of the age itself. To stand near a living mammoth would be to stand beside a creature that seemed older than the human group, larger than any shelter, and capable of reshaping the ground. Its bones could become structures, its ivory could become carvings, its fat could feed lamps, its hide could warm bodies, its death could sustain a community. Some prehistoric sites contain mammoth bone arrangements and dwellings, reminding us that these animals were not only seen but built into human life after death. The mammoth could be hunted, scavenged, feared, eaten, carved, remembered, and perhaps honoured. Its disappearance at the end of the Ice Age would later remove not only a source of material life, but a giant presence from human imagination. Animals may also have helped humans think about transformation. A person wearing a mask, hide, antler, feather, or painted pattern is not simply decorated. The body becomes uncertain. Is it human, animal, both, or something between? Some prehistoric images show composite beings, part human and part animal. Though their meanings are fiercely debated, they may represent shamans, spirits, masked dancers, mythic ancestors, or visual experiments whose purpose is lost. What matters is that the boundary between human and animal was imaginable as something flexible. The hunter who studies the animal begins to move like it, dream of it, wear it, imitate it, fear it, and depend on it. The animal enters the mind long before it enters myth. From such relationships, forgotten animal powers may have emerged, not pets, not symbols in the flat modern sense, but presences with agency. The bison that must be approached correctly, the bear that must not be offended, the bird that knows the sky road, the serpent that belongs to hidden earth, the mammoth whose bones become shelter, the lion whose silence beyond the fire sharpens every human nerve. These beings did not need written names to command respect. They were already larger than fear because they lived inside fear, food, memory, and survival. And when firelight moves across cave walls, it is not surprising that so many of the shapes returning from the stone are animal shapes. Humans may have buried their dead to keep them close, but they painted animals because animals filled the horizon of existence. Before the gods became kings, mothers, warriors, or judges, they may have been beasts in darkness breathing, watching, fleeing, attacking, returning with the seasons, and carrying in their bodies the terrible generosity of the world. If animals filled the horizon of sacred imagination, the human body became the place where that imagination could move. A body can run, kneel, tremble, paint itself, hide its face, change its voice, wear skin, hold fire, beat rhythm, and enter states that feel unlike ordinary waking life. Long before temples had doors and altars had carved names, ritual may have gathered around the body itself, breathing in darkness, circling a fire, stamping feet against earth, covering skin with ochre, charcoal, ash, fat, feathers, hides, teeth, shells, or bone. The evidence is scattered and often indirect, But what survives in the record suggests that prehistoric sacred life was not only seen on walls or placed with the dead, it was performed. A painted hand on stone is already more than an image. It is the trace of an action. Someone stood there. Someone lifted an arm. Someone mixed pigment, pressed skin to rock, or blew colour from the mouth. The handprint records a body in a specific moment, held between breath and surface. The same is true of footprints preserved in cave clay. In a few deep caves, ancient footprints remain where people once walked across soft floors, sometimes adults, sometimes children, sometimes moving through spaces far from daylight. These prints are among the rarest forms of intimacy in archaeology. They do not tell us exactly what is happening, but they show presence, movement, and direction. A ritual does not fossilize easily, yet here and there the ground remembers where bodies passed. Body paint may have been one of the oldest ritual technologies. Ochre and other pigments appear in archaeological contexts far older than many famous cave paintings. Pigment can protect skin from sun or insects, serve as decoration, mark identity, signal group membership, prepare for hunting, mourning, mating, initiation, healing, or ceremony. Its uses can be practical and symbolic at once. That is what makes it powerful. A person covered in red ochre is still a person, but also changed. The skin no longer looks ordinary. The body becomes a sign, in firelight. Red pigment can look like blood, heat, life, or fresh transformation. Scholars still debate how early pigments were used in specific cases, but the repeated collection and grinding of coloured minerals suggests that colour mattered deeply. Masks are harder to prove because many would have been made from perishable materials: hide, bark, fibre, feathers, wood, and plant matter that rarely survive over tens of thousands of years. Yet later prehistoric and historic societies show how masks can transform social reality. A masked person may become an animal, ancestor, spirit, healer, judge, trickster, or messenger from a realm beyond ordinary life. For Ice Age peoples, we cannot simply insert later practices into the deep past as if nothing changed. The evidence remains incomplete. Still, the presence of animal-human composite images in some Paleolithic art raises the possibility that people imagined, and perhaps enacted, states between human and animal. Whether these figures show masked dancers, mythic beings, ritual specialists, or visionary forms remains uncertain, but the idea of transformation is clearly present. The famous so-called sorcerer figures and hybrid forms from Paleolithic cave art have often been linked to shamanism, though that word must be used carefully. Shamanism describes a wide range of practices in which certain specialists enter altered states, communicate with spirits, heal, guide souls, or travel between worlds. Many hunter-gatherer societies have such specialists, but not all do, and their practices differ enormously. To say that Ice Age cave artists were shamans may sound neat, but it may also oversimplify a world we cannot hear. No single explanation fully accounts for the images. It is safer to say that some prehistoric art and ritual spaces are consistent with experiences of transformation, trance, and mediation between visible and invisible worlds, without pretending we know the exact titles, roles, or beliefs of the people involved. Altered states themselves, however, are a deeply human possibility. They do not require writing, cities, or formal theology. They can arise from rhythmic movement, chanting, drumming, darkness, fasting, pain, exhaustion, breath control, isolation, grief, fear, intense concentration, or psychoactive plants where such plants were known and used. A group gathered in a cave chamber, breathing smoke, listening to echoes, watching firelight animate painted animals, may have experienced the cave in a way very different from calm daylight observation. The human brain responds strongly to flicker, pattern, rhythm, sensory deprivation, and expectation. Shapes can appear in darkness, dots, grids, spirals, and animal forms can press into perception. Some researchers have connected certain abstract signs in cave art with visual effects produced in altered states, though this remains debated. One lesser-known detail is that many caves amplify sound in unusual ways. Chambers can echo, hum, distort footsteps, and carry voices from unexpected directions. In some painted sites, images appear in acoustically striking areas. Though the relationship is not always simple or universal, still, the possibility is compelling. A painted bison in a chamber where low sounds reverberate may not have been a silent picture. It may have been part of a sensory environment. A voice, chant, clap, or drumbeat could make the space feel inhabited. The cave could answer. To people already inclined to experience stone, darkness, and animal forms as charged with presence, sound may have made the unseen feel close. Ritual specialists, if they existed, may have carried heavy responsibilities. A person who knew the hidden chambers, the proper pigments, the stories of animal powers, the treatment of the dead, the songs for danger, the plants for pain, or the gestures for initiation would not be merely an artist. Such a person could stand at the edge of several worlds, hunter and healer, memory keeper and performer, observer of animals and interpreter of dreams. What survives in the record suggests that skill mattered. The best Ice Age art shows remarkable control, confidence, and knowledge. It may have been made by many hands, but some hands were surely trained by long practice. Yet ritual does not require a professional priesthood. In small groups, sacred action may belong to everyone at certain moments. A burial, a hunt, a birth, a season of hunger, a first kill, a return to a cave, a child's passage into adulthood, all could gather people into shared performance. Around the fire, the body becomes memory's instrument. Older people demonstrate movements. Younger people watch. Songs carry information. Dances map animal motion. Paint marks belonging. A story is not simply told, it is embodied. This may be one reason ritual is so durable across human history. The body remembers what the mind alone may lose. The firelit ritual body is therefore one of the most important bridges between the first sacred landscapes and the later gods of history. Before statues, the body can become the statue. Before scripture, breath can carry sacred speech. Before temples, the cave, hearth, clearing, or burial ground can become a stage. Before gods have names, humans can meet powers by changing themselves in their presence. A person painted red, wearing antlers, moving in rhythm before a wall of animals, may not be pretending in the shallow sense. For that moment, the boundary between human, animal, ancestor, and unseen force may become unstable. This instability is at the heart of early religion. It suggests that the forgotten gods were not only believed in, they were approached through sensation, heat on the face, pigment on the skin, smoke in the lungs, stone under bare feet, rhythm in the chest, darkness behind the eyes. The sacred was not an idea floating above life. It entered muscle, breath, fear, and exhaustion. It took hold of the body and made the ordinary self feel porous. And when the fire died down, when pigment cracked on skin, when the dancers grew still, when the cave returned to darkness, something of the experience may have remained. The painted animals stayed on the wall, the footprints stayed in clay, the handprints stayed like pale ghosts against mineral colour. The people stepped back into the night, perhaps carrying no doctrine that we could recognise, but carrying memory in their bodies. Before history began, the gods may have been met not by reading, but by trembling, moving, painting, and becoming something slightly other than human for a little while. From the firelit body, the trail of prehistoric belief leads toward another kind of body, smaller, quieter, and much harder to interpret. Across parts of Ice Age Europe and later Neolithic worlds, archaeologists have found figures shaped in clay, stone, bone, ivory, and other materials, many of them emphasizing breasts, bellies, hips, thighs, or the signs of pregnancy and maturity. Some are tiny enough to fit in the palm, some are carefully carved, some are rough, almost abstract. Some have no face, or only the faintest suggestion of one. Others seem to draw the viewer's attention away from individual identity and toward the body as a source of birth, nourishment, flesh, and continuity. Few prehistoric objects have inspired more fascination, and few have been more confidently misunderstood. It is tempting to call them mother goddesses. For a long time, many people did. The idea is powerful before kings, before armies, before male storm gods, before written law. Perhaps humanity worshipped a great mother, an earth power, a universal goddess of fertility and life. The image feels complete, almost too complete. It gives prehistory a sacred centre. It turns scattered figurines into evidence of one vast ancient religion. It offers an origin story in which the first divine power is female, generous, and rooted in the body of the earth. But archaeology rarely gives such easy gifts. Scholars still debate what these figurines meant, and the evidence remains incomplete. Some may have been connected with fertility, others may not. Some may have represented women, ancestors, spirits, charms, ideals, memories, teachings, or categories of being that have no modern equivalent. The famous Paleolithic female figurines, often called Venus figures, are among the best-known examples, though that nickname is misleading. It comes from much later classical ideas of beauty and love, not from the people who made them. These figurines were created thousands upon thousands of years before the Roman goddess Venus existed. Their bodies vary widely. Some are full and rounded, with carefully emphasized breasts and bellies. Some show engraved hair, head coverings, or woven patterns. Some lack feet, some have faces hidden or absent. A few seem portable, perhaps carried in pouches, passed between hands, or kept close to the body. Others may have been placed, lost, discarded, or deposited in ways we do not fully understand. What survives in the record suggests importance, but not a single meaning. Fertility remains one plausible interpretation, because birth is one of the most powerful realities in any human society, especially in deep prehistory. Pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, infant survival, and the health of mothers would have mattered intensely to small groups living close to hunger, injury, cold, and disease. A successful birth was not simply private joy, it was the continuation of the group. A failed birth could mean grief, danger, and the loss of knowledge, labour, and future kinship. The female body, in this sense, carried a mystery no less profound than death. A new person appears from within another person. Blood, pain, milk, and life are bound together. It is not difficult to imagine that such a process could become sacred. But the figurines may not be straightforward fertility idols. Some do not show obvious pregnancy. Some may represent age, status, abundance, health, erotic power, womanhood, self-image, or symbolic categories related to survival in cold climates. One lesser-known idea suggests that some Ice Age figurines may depict bodies with fatness not as a beauty standard in the modern sense, but as a sign of stored energy, resilience, or successful living in harsh environments. Another interpretation proposes that some were made by women looking down at their own bodies, which could help explain the exaggerated view of breasts and belly and the reduced face or feet, though this remains debated. Still others see the figurines as teaching objects, ritual tools, protective charms for pregnancy, or representations of ancestors rather than deities. The absence of faces is especially important. A face individualizes. It says this person, this expression, this identity. A faceless body can become broader, more symbolic, more open. It might represent not one woman but womanhood, birth, a lineage, a spirit, a dead ancestor, or a condition of transformation. Yet even this is uncertain. A missing face can result from style, damage, choice, or convention. Archaeology often forces humility by giving us the object without the gesture that explained it. A figurine in a hand, in a pouch, in a burial, in a house, in a ritual gathering, or in a child's play space could have very different meanings. Without the living context, interpretation must move carefully. Later, Neolithic figurines add new layers. As people settle into farming villages, small human figures become common in some regions, especially across parts of the Near East, southeastern Europe, and Anatolia. Some are seated, some stand, some are female, some male, some ambiguous, some are broken deliberately, perhaps after use. Some appear in domestic spaces rather than grand temples. In certain places, figurines are found in houses, near hearths, in storage areas, or in deposits that suggest repeated household ritual. They do not always point to a single goddess cult. Instead, they may show how sacred power was woven through daily life birth, food, ancestors, animals, houses, fields, seasons, and the dangerous hope that life will continue. The connection between women, earth, and fertility becomes especially compelling with farming, but it may not be as simple as earth equals mother. Seeds disappear into soil and return as green growth. Bodies enter graves and bones remain in the ground. Blood, rain, milk, grain, and birth all become part of one great pattern of disappearance and emergence. Farmers, more than mobile foragers, live by waiting for hidden processes. They place seed in darkness and trust that something unseen is happening beneath the surface. They bury the dead and continue to live beside them. They watch pregnant bellies and swelling fields with the same anxious dependence on time. It is easy to see how earth, body, and fertility could become linked in ritual thought. Still, the Great Mother Goddess theory, in its broadest form, has problems. It often assumes unity where the archaeological record shows variety. It sometimes turns every female figure into a goddess and every rounded body into a fertility symbol, ignoring other possibilities. It can project modern desires onto ancient objects, making prehistory into either a lost paradise of peaceful goddess worship or a simple stage before later male domination. The truth is almost certainly more complex. Prehistoric societies differed across regions, climates, economies, and eras. Their figurines may have meant different things in different hands. No single explanation fully accounts for this. What matters is not whether every figurine is a goddess, but that these objects reveal a sacred imagination deeply concerned with bodies. The animal body, the dead body, the painted ritual body, and now the fertile or ancestral human body all become places where invisible forces gather. A belly can mean hunger or abundance. A breast can mean nourishment, sexuality, motherhood, or survival. A womb can mean life, danger, and mystery. A figurine held in the hand may have made those forces tangible. It allowed someone to touch a shape connected to birth, identity, hope, fear, or memory. If there were forgotten gods before history, some may have been mother-like, earth-like, or body-like, but they were probably not simple. They may have been protectors of birth, and also reminders of death. They may have promised abundance, but carried the terror of failed harvests and lost children. They may have lived not in palaces above the clouds, but in clay, fat, milk, blood, seed, and soil. Their power was close, intimate, and unavoidable. The small figurines do not speak, but their silence is not empty. They survive as a warning against easy answers and as a window into one of humanity's oldest recognitions. Life comes from darkness before it comes into light. A child forms unseen. A seed breaks underground. A body returns to earth. The sacred for prehistoric people may have pulsed through these hidden transformations, and in the palm-sized bodies left behind. We glimpse a world where the mystery of birth could stand beside the mystery of death as one of the first great powers humans ever tried to hold. The small figurines bring the sacred close enough to hold, but the sacred was never confined to objects. It spread outward again into land. Long before temples lifted their walls into the open air, people were already marking places that seemed to gather memory more densely than others. A cave chamber could become charged because darkness changed the senses. But outside the cave there were cliffs where echoes returned like hidden voices, springs where water appeared from beneath stone, river crossings where movement narrowed into danger, ridgelines where the sky opened wider, and burial grounds where the dead gave the earth a human history. The first sacred landscapes were not built all at once. They accumulated slowly through return, attention, fear, gratitude, and story. A landscape becomes sacred when it stops being merely space and becomes remembered space. A hill is not just a hill if ancestors are buried below it. A spring is not just water if generations have stopped there in drought, if children were born nearby, if a healing plant grows at its edge, if animals gather there at dusk, if someone once vanished in its reeds and was later spoken of in low voices. A path is not just a route if it follows the migration of herds, the movement of stars, the old way between seasonal camps, or the trail walked by the dead before they were laid into the ground. Prehistoric people lived in worlds where memory had no books to rest in, so memory attached itself to features that endured stone, water, caves, trees, bones, and horizons. This is one of the reasons sacred places may be older than permanent buildings. A constructed shrine can be abandoned, burned, rebuilt, or forgotten. A mountain remains, a spring keeps rising, a cliff face still catches sunset, a cave mouth still opens like a dark eye in the side of the earth. For mobile foragers, who may have moved with seasons and herds, fixed places could serve as anchors in a life of motion. Return itself may have been ritual, to come back to the same painted cave, the same burial place, the same river bend, the same stone outcrop, was to reconnect the living group with earlier journeys and earlier dead. What survives in the record suggests that certain places were visited repeatedly across long spans of time, though scholars still debate whether every repeated visit was ritual, practical, seasonal, or some mixture of all three. Open-air sites are harder to preserve than caves, which is one reason the sacred landscape of deep prehistory is probably much larger than the surviving evidence. Rain, frost, roots, floods, and human disturbance erase traces from exposed ground. Pigment fades, wood decays, skin, fibre, and feathers disappear. A ritual performed on a windswept ridge may leave nothing that archaeology can recognize. This gives caves an accidental advantage. Their darkness protected what the open world lost. But it would be a mistake to imagine that sacred life happened mostly underground simply because caves preserve better. The sky, water, and earth almost certainly carried their own powers. Burial grounds show this especially clearly. When the dead are placed in particular locations, the land becomes social. A stretch of ground becomes more than soil. It becomes a relationship. Some ancient burials seem isolated, while others appear in clusters or reused places, suggesting that the dead could gather over time. Later, prehistoric communities sometimes placed the dead beneath house floors, near settlements, in cemeteries, or under mounds that changed the visible shape of the land. These later examples help illuminate a broader human tendency, though they cannot be projected backward too simply. The evidence remains incomplete. Still, the pattern is striking once the dead are placed somewhere deliberately. The living world acquires invisible inhabitants. Water may have been another early centre of sacred attention. Springs are naturally mysterious because they reverse expectation. Water should fall from the sky, run along the surface, collect in streams, and drain away. But at a spring, water emerges from underground as if the earth itself is breathing. Some springs are warm. Some are mineral-rich and stained stone with strange colours. Some bubble, steam, or leave deposits that look almost alive. In many later cultures, springs become places of healing, offering, prophecy, and danger. For prehistory, direct proof is often thin, but the attraction is easy to understand. A spring is a threshold between hidden and visible worlds. It brings the unseen upward. Rivers also divide and connect. They carry fish, reeds, clay, stones, driftwood, and sometimes the bodies of animals or people. They can be roads, borders, traps, and sources of renewal. A flood can destroy a camp and also feed a plain. A crossing can be safe in one season and deadly in another. Places where people repeatedly cross rivers may become loaded with memory because they concentrate risk. Decisions happen there, goods pass there, strangers may be met there. The living may leave offerings there, though the earliest evidence is often hard to distinguish from accidental loss. No single explanation fully accounts for objects found in watery places in later prehistory. Some may be discarded, some lost, some deliberately deposited. But the long human habit of giving things to water suggests that rivers were never merely useful. Cliffs and unusual stones offered another kind of power. They stood out. A striking boulder in an otherwise open landscape could become a landmark, meeting point, boundary, or focus of story. A cliff could shelter, threaten, echo, and frame the sky. Rock art in open landscapes, where it survives, shows that people marked stone surfaces outside caves as well as within them. Engravings, pecked images, cup marks, animal forms, human figures, and abstract signs appear in many regions and periods, often near routes, water sources, hunting grounds, or places with broad views. One lesser-known detail is that some rock art sites are positioned where light changes dramatically at certain times of day, making carvings easier or harder to see as the sun moves. Whether this was always intentional is debated, but the effect would not have gone unnoticed. Routes themselves may have carried sacred meaning. A path walked repeatedly becomes a line of memory across land. It links camps, water, stone sources, hunting grounds, burial places, and seasonal gathering sites. Along such routes, stories can be arranged like beads on a cord. One rock marks where an ancestor fell. One grove marks where a herd was first seen after winter. One ridge marks the place where the stars become visible above a notch in the hills. In societies without written maps, landscape memory can be astonishingly precise. Knowledge travels in song, gesture, and repeated movement. A sacred geography does not require walls. It requires remembered relationships. By this point, the forgotten gods are becoming harder to separate from place. The animal in the cave, the ancestor in the grave, the figure in the hand, the spring from underground, the cliff that answers with echoes, the path that carries old footsteps, all begin to form a world where power is distributed rather than centralized. There is not yet a single temple city drawing offering from fields and villages. There may be many charged points, each with its own danger, story, and proper behavior. Some places may welcome, others may forbid. Some may be entered only by certain people, at certain times with certain gestures. The earliest sacred landscapes were probably not uniform systems. They were networks of memory. And perhaps that is why they endured. A named god can be forgotten when language changes. A shrine can fall. A myth can break apart, but a spring still rises from darkness, a cliff still holds shadow, a burial mound still changes the line of the ground, a path still follows the easiest way through hills. Long before history began, humans were already teaching the land to remember them, and learning in return to treat the land as something that remembered back. The sacred landscape eventually takes stone into its own hands, not the small stone of a blade, bead, or figurine, and not the hidden wall of a painted cave, but great shaped pillars raised in the open hills, where wind passes over dry grass and the horizon spreads wide under the sky. At Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, the forgotten gods before history seem to step out of darkness and stand upright. They do not speak. They have no written names. Yet their silence is immense. Ring after ring of carved limestone pillars, some shaped like giant T-forms, stand in enclosures built and remembered long before the first cities of Mesopotamia, long before pyramids, long before bronze kings wrote victories into clay and stone. Göbekli Tepe rises on a limestone ridge near the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent. in a region where wild cereals, gazelle, aurochs, boar, foxes, birds, and other animals formed part of a rich post-Ice Age world. This was not yet a kingdom. It was not a city with streets, palaces, and walls. The people who created the oldest monumental layers were living at a time when farming was emerging but had not yet fully remade society into settled agricultural life. For decades. Many scholars assumed that large temples came after agriculture, after surplus grain, after villages grew into towns. Göbekli Tepe complicated that sequence. Here, monumental ritual architecture appears at the threshold of farming, and perhaps before farming had fully taken hold among the builders. The pillars themselves are the shock. Some are massive, weighing many tons, quarried from nearby limestone and shaped with stone tools by people who had no metal, no wheels, and no draft animals. The labour required was not impossible, but it was organised. Stone had to be selected, cut, moved, raised, carved, and arranged. Food had to be provided. Decisions had to be made about layout, timing, and meaning. This does not require a state, a king, or a priesthood in the later sense. But it does suggest cooperation on a scale that cannot be reduced to random effort. What survives in the record suggests that ritual may have helped bring people together before agriculture created permanent hierarchies strong enough to do it by force. Around the enclosures, animals appear again: foxes, snakes, boars, birds, scorpions, wild cattle, cranes, and other creatures are carved in relief on the pillars, their bodies sharp and deliberate against pale stone. Some seem to crawl, leap, stare, or threaten. They are not peaceful farm animals arranged in neat domestic order. They belong to a wild symbolic world. Snakes twist in tense lines, a boar bristles with force, a scorpion waits with its tail raised. These are beings of edge, danger, and transformation. The old animal powers have not disappeared. They have been lifted from cave walls and portable objects into monumental public stone. At the centre of some enclosures stand two larger T-shaped pillars, often interpreted as stylized human-like beings, because several bear carved arms, hands, belts, and loincloth-like forms. If this interpretation is right, the pillars may represent powerful ancestors, spirits, mythic persons, or beings beyond ordinary humanity. But caution is essential. No inscription explains them. No living tradition can be securely traced back to their builders. Scholars still debate whether the central pillars are gods, ancestors, ritual persons, symbolic posts, or something else entirely. The evidence remains incomplete. What can be said is that they turn the enclosure into a charged social space, where human-like forms stand among animals, as if presiding over a world in which people, beasts, death, and unseen powers are bound together. One of the most surprising features of Göbekli Tepe is that these enclosures were deliberately filled in. The buildings were not simply left to collapse in ruin. Many appear to have been buried with stones, soil, animal bones, and debris, preserving them beneath artificial mounds. Was it a ritual closing a rebuilding cycle, a way of retiring sacred spaces whose time had passed? A practical response to changing needs? No single explanation fully accounts for this. Yet deliberate burial gives the site a strange rhythm of creation and concealment. People raised the pillars, gathered around them, carved animals into them, and then covered them over, as if returning sacred architecture to the earth. The bones found at the site add another layer. Many animal remains belong to wild species, especially gazelle and other hunted animals, suggesting feasting or large gatherings rather than a fully domesticated farming economy in the oldest phases. Feasting can be more than eating. It can create alliances, settle obligations, display generosity, transmit stories, and draw scattered groups into shared identity. A gathering at Göbekli Tepe may have included food, labour, ritual, memory, and spectacle all at once. People could arrive from different bands or settlements, participate in building or ceremony, eat together, and leave carrying a stronger sense of belonging to something larger than the immediate household. This is where Göbekli Tepe becomes more than a site. It becomes a turning point in how the sacred organizes human life. In the cave, ritual may have drawn people into hidden darkness. At a burial ground, the dead anchored memory to place. Along routes and springs, power gathered in landscapes already meaningful. But at Göbekli Tepe, people seem to reshape the landscape itself in order to make a center. Stone is not merely found sacred, it is quarried, carved, lifted, and arranged into a new kind of sacred order. The world is no longer only encountered as charged, it is being built as charged. The relationship between this ritual world and the rise of farming remains one of the great questions. Some researchers suggest that communal ritual gatherings may have encouraged people to intensify food production, manage wild cereals, and eventually domesticate plants and animals to support larger events. Others argue that early sedentism and changing subsistence patterns made such construction possible. The truth may not be either or. Ritual and farming may have fed each other. Gathering people for ceremonies creates demand for food. Producing more food allows bigger gatherings. Bigger gatherings create stronger shared myths, stronger obligations, and eventually more complex communities. The gods, or whatever powers stood in those enclosures, may not have waited for agriculture. They may have helped pull it into being. By the time the wind moves over the buried enclosures, the story has changed. The forgotten gods are no longer only flickers in caves, presences in rivers, or ancestors under earth. They have become capable of gathering labor, shaping stone, and holding communities around a center. Their names are still missing, but their social power is visible. In the silent pillars of Göbekli Tepe, Prehistory reveals one of its deepest surprises before humans built cities for gods. They may have built gods into the very possibility of living together. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe stand at a threshold, and beyond that threshold the human world begins to change its rhythm. For hundreds of thousands of years, people had lived by movement, attention, and return. They followed herds, gathered seasonal plants, watched weather, remembered water, and carried their sacred stories through landscapes that were never still. Then, slowly and unevenly, in different regions and at different times, some groups began to stay. Wild grains were watched more carefully, harvested more intensely, then encouraged, selected, and finally domesticated. Animals that had once been hunted at a distance began to be managed, penned, bred, milked, and counted. Villages became more permanent. Houses returned year after year to the same ground. The old powers did not vanish, but the terms of human fear and hope began to change. Farming is often described as progress, but for the people who first lived through it, it was also a bargain with uncertainty. A hunter may fail, but a field can fail everyone at once. Seeds placed in soil are promises made to the future, and the future is unreliable. Too little rain, and the grain withers. Too much rain, and it rots. Frost comes late, insects arrive, birds descend, cattle sicken, stored food molds. A river does not flood when expected, or floods too violently. In a farming world, survival becomes tied to cycles that humans can influence but never fully control. The sacred therefore begins to gather around seasons, growth, fertility, weather, and the anxious waiting between planting and harvest. This is one of the great transformations in the history of the gods. Earlier sacred powers may have lived in wild animals, caves, storms, ancestors, and difficult landscapes. Farming does not erase those powers, but it pulls them into a new pattern. The storm is no longer only terrifying because lightning can kill, or thunder can shake the night. It becomes terrifying because rain decides whether children will eat months later. The sun is no longer only warmth, direction, and day. It becomes the force that ripens grain and dries fields. The earth is no longer only the ground walked over, the place of burial, the source of stone, roots, and ochre. It becomes the body into which seed is placed and from which food must return. The sacred becomes agricultural because human dependence becomes agricultural. What survives in the record suggests that this change did not happen overnight. Early farming communities still hunted, gathered wild plants, and lived close to non-domesticated animals. The boundary between forager and farmer was often blurred for long periods. Scholars still debate how much the earliest farmers understood about selection, breeding, and plant change, and how much emerged through repeated practice rather than deliberate design. But the consequences were immense. Once people invested labour in fields, storage pits, houses, and herds, they became tied to particular places in a new way. A field is not easily carried away. A herd requires protection. Stored grain creates both security and temptation. Land becomes memory, wealth, risk, inheritance, and conflict. With farming comes a different experience of time. The year becomes a circle of necessary acts: clearing, sowing, watching, weeding, guarding, harvesting, threshing, grinding, storing, birthing animals, moving flocks, repairing houses, preparing again. Ritual could attach itself to each stage, not because people were superstitious in some simple sense, but because each stage carried danger. A seed ritual may express hope. A harvest feast may express relief. A first-fruits offering may acknowledge that food has arrived from forces beyond human labour alone. A ceremony for cattle fertility may be a practical prayer wrapped in social memory. No single explanation fully accounts for prehistoric ritual, but farming made repetition unavoidable, and repetition is one of ritual's strongest foundations. Grain itself is strange if watched closely enough. It looks dead when stored, dry and silent in baskets or pits. Then it is buried. For a time nothing visible happens. Beneath the soil, hidden from sight, the seed splits and changes form. A green shoot appears. A field rises where there was only earth. Later, the plant dies back and leaves more seed behind. To farming people, this cycle would have been practical knowledge, but practical knowledge does not make it less mysterious. The same pattern echoes through birth, death, burial, and return. A body goes into the earth. A seed goes into the earth. One decays, the other grows. Later religions would build elaborate myths around dying and returning powers of vegetation, but the emotional root may be much older. Life seems to come from what has disappeared. Domesticated animals altered sacred imagination as well. Wild animals are encountered through pursuit, fear, and distance. Herd animals live nearer. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs become part of daily sound and smell. They are fed, guarded, bred, slaughtered, milked, counted, exchanged, and inherited. Their bodies become wealth on legs. Their fertility matters to human survival. Their illnesses create anxiety. Their blood marks feasts and sacrifices. Cattle especially could gather enormous symbolic power because of their size, strength, milk, horns, and value. The wild aurochs had already impressed prehistoric imagination. The domesticated cow and bull brought that power into the village, closer to houses, fields, and human control, though never completely under control. The relationship between humans and animals therefore becomes more intimate and more unequal. A hunter must respect the animal's freedom because the animal can escape. A herder controls breeding, movement, and death more directly. That control may have encouraged new ideas about ownership, blessing, purity, exchange, and sacrifice. To give an animal to unseen powers is to give something valuable. To slaughter one at a gathering is to turn stored life into social force. Blood, meat, smoke, bone, and shared eating become ways of binding people to each other and perhaps to the powers they believe sustain the herd. The evidence remains incomplete for the earliest phases, but later patterns suggest that animal sacrifice did not appear from nowhere. It grew from long relationships among value, death, food, and the sacred. Farming also changed human inequality, and with it, perhaps, the gods. When food can be stored, someone must guard it, divide it, count it, and remember who contributed. When land matters, boundaries matter. When herds grow, ownership matters. When houses endure, descent and inheritance become harder to ignore. Sacred powers may begin to support claims this lineage belongs here. This field is protected. This ancestor watches. This season requires obedience. This leader knows the proper rights. The earliest farming gods may not have been kings yet, but they were moving toward a world in which ritual and authority could strengthen each other. Still, this was not a clean replacement of old belief with new religion. The cave, the ancestor, the animal, the spring, and the firelit body remained part of the human imagination. Farming gathered them into a denser web. The ancestor now watched over a house and field. The animal now belonged to herd and sacrifice. The storm now carried the fate of crops. The earth now held seed, dead, memory, and property together. The forgotten gods were changing because human life was changing. They were becoming seasonal, settled, demanding, and closer to the daily labour of survival. In the fields of early villages, the sacred may have felt less like a sudden encounter in darkness, and more like a long waiting under the sky. A person presses seed into soil, covers it, and steps away. Nothing answers at once. Days pass, clouds gather or do not. Birds pick at the ground. Children ask when food will come. The earth keeps its silence. Then, if weather, labour, luck, and unseen powers align, green appears. That small blade breaking through soil may have been as holy. In its quiet way, as any animal breathing on a cave wall. As farming settles people more firmly onto the land, the sacred does not remain only on ridges, in caves, beside springs, or among great pillars. It begins to move indoors. The house becomes more than shelter from wind and rain. It becomes a container of memory, labour, birth, food, sleep, illness, death, and inheritance. Its walls hold smoke. Its floor receives spilled grain, broken tools, children's footprints, ash from cooking fires, and sometimes the bones of the dead. In the older moving world, sacred power often clung to places people returned to across seasons. In the village world, return happens every morning. The doorway, the hearth, the storage bin, the sleeping platform, the roof beam, and the packed earth floor become part of a daily sacred geography. This is one of the quieter revolutions in religious history. The gods before history do not only grow larger as communities gather, they also grow smaller, closer, more domestic. A spirit does not need a mountain if it has a threshold. An ancestor does not need a distant cemetery if the dead lie beneath the floor. A protective power does not need a monumental sanctuary if a small figurine, a bowl, a skull, or a painted mark can stand near the hearth. What survives in the record suggests that Neolithic households were often ritual spaces as much as economic ones, though scholars still debate how to interpret many of the objects found inside them. A figurine in a house might be sacred, playful, protective, ancestral, decorative, or used in a ceremony now impossible to reconstruct. Still, the pattern is too persistent to ignore. The sacred had entered the room. At sites such as Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, the house appears almost like a living archive. People entered many homes from above, through roof openings, descending into rooms where platforms, hearths, bins, wall paintings, reliefs, and burials formed a dense interior world. The dead were sometimes buried beneath floors and platforms, close to the living who cooked, slept, worked, and told stories above them. This is difficult for modern people to imagine without discomfort, because many modern societies separate the dead from domestic life. But in such communities, the dead may have been part of the household's foundation in a literal and social sense. They did not vanish into a remote afterlife. They remained underfoot, remembered through place, perhaps visited through ritual, and woven into the continuity of the home. The treatment of skulls is especially striking. In parts of the Neolithic Near East, some skulls were removed after burial, plastered, modelled, painted, and sometimes given shell eyes. These plastered skulls are among the most intimate and unsettling objects from early farming societies. They are not portraits in the modern sense, but they restore a face-like presence to the dead. The skull, cleaned of flesh and reshaped with plaster, becomes neither fully person nor object. It becomes a presence that can be kept, displayed, buried again, or perhaps used in ceremonies of memory and belonging. No single explanation fully accounts for their meaning. They may have represented ancestors, lineage claims, household identity, powerful dead, or rituals of transformation. But their care shows that the human face, even after death, could remain socially alive. In a farming village, ancestry matters in new ways. A mobile band may remember its dead through story and burial places, but a settled household can root those memories into architecture. This house belonged to those before us. This floor covers our dead. This hearth has warmed generations. This storage room holds grain grown from land we claim and defend. The ancestor becomes not only a remembered person, but part of a household's authority. The living may draw legitimacy from the dead beneath them. The dead may protect, judge, or bind the family to place. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is not difficult to see how domestic ritual and property could become intertwined. In a settled world, memory can become territorial. The hearth stands at the centre of this transformation. Fire had always mattered, but a fixed hearth gives fire a home. It cooks food, hardens clay, warms bodies, smokes meat, pushes back darkness, gathers people, and marks the centre of daily life. Ash builds up, pots blacken, stories are told beside it. Children learn by watching hands move in firelight. A hearth can become a practical tool, a family centre, and a sacred point all at once. Later traditions across the world often imagine hearth spirits, household gods, or ancestral powers near domestic fires. For Neolithic households, direct names are missing, but the logic is old. The flame that keeps the house alive is not merely useful. It is watched, fed, protected, and feared. Storage also carried sacred weight. Grain stored in bins or pits is survival held against the future. It is food not yet eaten, labour preserved, hope made visible. But storage creates anxiety because it can be stolen, spoiled, infested, counted unfairly, or exhausted before the next harvest. A storage area may therefore attract ritual attention. Small objects found near bins, unusual deposits under floors, animal remains, figurines, or carefully placed items may reflect practices meant to protect abundance. Though archaeologists must be careful not to call every odd deposit an altar, the evidence can be ambiguous. A broken pot may be trash, a foundation offering, a memory object, or all of these depending on context. Prehistoric houses do not explain themselves. Still, some arrangements do feel deliberate. Animal horns set into walls, modelled reliefs, painted scenes, benches, platforms, and repeated deposits suggest that certain interior spaces carried meanings beyond ordinary use. At Çatalhöyük, installations associated with wild bulls and other animals show that the old animal powers did not disappear when people settled into houses. The wild still entered the domestic imagination. A bull's horns fixed into a room could evoke strength, danger, fertility, feasting, hunting memory, or household prestige. Scholars still debate the details, but the presence of such imagery inside homes shows how the boundary between house and cosmos remained porous. The room could hold the field, the herd, the ancestor, the wild animal, and the unseen. Figurines also travelled into domestic life. Some may have been used briefly and discarded. Some were broken. Some were found in ordinary refuse, which complicates the assumption that they were always sacred treasures. But sacred things are not always treated like museum objects. A ritual item can be powerful for one event and then thrown away. A charm can be used until its work is done. A figure can be broken deliberately to release, end, or transform its power. What looks like rubbish to archaeology may once have been the remains of action. This is one of the great difficulties of studying prehistoric religion. Meaning often lies not in the object alone, but in what was done with it. The hidden altar of prehistory may not have looked like an altar at all. It may have been a corner near a hearth, a skull kept for a season, a plastered face brought out at certain moments, a figurine pressed into a wall niche, a bowl of grain set aside, a horn mounted above a platform, a child taught not to step on a certain patch of floor. Sacred power becomes intimate, repetitive, and domestic. It lives in cleaning, cooking, burying, grinding, feeding, remembering, and closing the door against night. By bringing the dead and the divine into the house, early farmers changed the emotional scale of religion. The sacred was no longer only encountered during extraordinary journeys into caves or gatherings around monumental pillars. It was present in the ordinary room where people woke hungry, argued, repaired tools, nursed infants, mourned parents, and waited for rain. The forgotten gods before history were becoming household companions, not always gentle, not always clearly separate from ancestors or animals, but close enough to share the smoke. And in that closeness, religion gained a new durability. A temple can fall out of use, but a home renews itself through daily need. Every meal repeats dependence. Every birth repeats mystery. Every death renews memory. Every fire must be kept alive. Beneath the roof of the Neolithic house, the sacred learn to survive not only in awe and terror, but in habit. Above the roof of the Neolithic house, above the smoke hole and the storage bins, above the fields waiting for rain, another sacred order stretched across the sky. It had always been there, of course. Long before farming, people watched the heavens for direction, weather, migration, and the changing length of nights. But settled life gave the sky a new kind of pressure. When grain depends on timing, when herds breed with seasons, when storage must last until the next harvest, the movements of sun, moon, and stars become more than beautiful. They become a calendar written in light, and a mistake in reading it can mean hunger. The sun is the most obvious power because it rules daily life with a force no one can ignore. It brings warmth, makes shadows, dries mud, hardens earth, ripens grain, and vanishes each evening with unsettling regularity. In the depths of winter, when days shorten and cold presses close to the body, the sun's return is not an abstract astronomical event. It is relief slowly made visible. Each day after the turning point, light lasts a little longer, to people living without electric time. This gradual change would be felt in the bones. The winter solstice, though not necessarily named as such, marks a moment when darkness reaches its limit and begins to retreat. It is easy to understand why later cultures treated this turning with ritual gravity, and it is likely that the roots of such attention reach far back into prehistoric observation. The moon offers a different rhythm. It does not command the day like the sun, but it changes shape, disappears, returns, and divides time into visible cycles. A full moon can brighten night travel, hunting, gathering, herding, or ceremony. A dark moon can deepen danger. Its phases are close enough to human-scale time to be remembered, counted, and used. Some researchers have suggested that certain prehistoric markings on bone or stone may record lunar cycles. Though many such claims remain debated, the evidence remains incomplete, and not every row of marks is a calendar. Still, the human impulse to count nights, pregnancies, tides, seasons, and returns is ancient. The moon gives the sky a pulse. Stars carry memory across longer distances. Certain stars or constellations rise before dawn at particular times of year. Their appearance can signal coming cold, the movement of animals, the right time to harvest, or the approach of seasonal gatherings. Prehistoric people did not need modern astronomy to notice that the sky changes predictably. They did not need mathematics written on tablets to understand that certain lights return in order. Observation repeated across generations becomes knowledge, and knowledge preserved in story becomes sacred. A star may be a direction marker, a seasonal sign, an ancestor fire, an animal path, or a spirit track, depending on the culture that reads it. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric sky watching was probably practical and symbolic at once. Stone made that watching durable. A person can remember where the sun rises in midsummer by standing in the same place year after year, but a stone alignment fixes attention into the ground. A post hole, a marker, a mound, a passage, a ring, or a horizon notch can turn observation into architecture. Later prehistoric monuments across many regions show concern with solar and lunar events, though each site must be interpreted carefully. Some alignments are convincing, others are disputed, exaggerated or invented by modern imagination. No single explanation fully accounts for all stone monuments. Some were tombs, some gathering places, some territorial markers, some ritual centres, some astronomical devices, and many were probably several of these at once. The great megalithic traditions of Europe belong mostly to a later Neolithic world than Göbekli Tepe's earliest enclosures, but they reveal how deeply stone, death, and sky could become entangled. Passage tombs, standing stones, circles, and alignments do not merely occupy land, they frame moments. At certain sites, sunlight enters a chamber at a particular turning of the year, illuminating inner stone after long darkness. Whether every detail was planned exactly as modern visitors imagine is debated, but the effect, where genuine, is powerful. A tomb can become a place where the sun enters the earth. The dead rest in darkness, and then light reaches them on the hinge of the year. In such a moment, cosmic time, ancestral memory, and stone architecture become one experience. This union of the dead and the sky may be one of the most important steps toward later religion. Ancestors under floors tie a family to a house. Ancestors in monumental tombs tie a community to land and time. If the sun reaches the chamber only at a certain season, the ancestors become part of the calendar. The living return not whenever they wish, but when the sky itself appears to open the way. Ceremony becomes scheduled by the heavens. The sacred is no longer only where power is felt, it is when power returns. Agriculture sharpened this need for sacred timing. Plant too early, and frost can kill the shoots. Plant too late, and the crop may fail before maturity. Bring animals to certain pastures too soon, and they may starve. Too late, and grasses may be lost. Store poorly, and a year's labour decays in darkness. A calendar is therefore not just a tool of priests, it is a technology of survival, but in a world where time is measured by celestial beings. Ritual experts who know the sky can gain authority. The person who remembers the turning of the sun, the return of a star, or the correct timing of a feast holds knowledge that affects everyone. Here again, sacred power and social power begin to draw closer. One lesser-known detail is that many prehistoric monuments required not only building labour, but long-term maintenance of memory. A stone ring means little if later generations forget how to use it, when to gather, which direction to watch, or what story gives it meaning. The monument is only half the system. The other half is oral tradition songs, gestures, myths, warnings, seasonal instructions, and repeated ceremonies. When people stand inside a ring of stones at dawn, they are not simply observing astronomy, they are participating in inherited attention. The sky becomes readable because the ancestors taught the living where to look. The old animal powers did not disappear from this skybound world. Birds still crossed between earth and heaven. Bulls, deer, serpents, and other creatures continued to appear in carvings and rituals. In many later mythologies, animals are placed among the stars, storms are driven by divine beasts, and the sun itself may travel in a boat, on wings, or through an underworld. It would be unsafe to project those later myths unchanged into prehistory, but their persistence suggests that humans kept linking the heavens to familiar living forms. The sky was vast, but it was not empty. It could be imagined through animals, ancestors, fires, paths, eyes, wheels, boats, or shining bodies crossing darkness. By tying ritual to sun and moon, prehistoric people widened the scale of the sacred. The cave had brought them into the earth. The house had brought the sacred into daily life. The field had tied it to growth. Stone monuments and celestial cycles now lifted it into cosmic order. The forgotten gods before history were becoming powers of time itself. They ruled not by decree, but by return, dawn after night, moon after darkness, summer after winter, harvest after seed. Generation after generation after generation. And beneath that turning sky, a person could stand beside stone and feel both small and held within pattern. The sun rises where the elders said it would. The shadow falls along the old line. The moon swells again after vanishing. The dead remain in the earth, but light returns to them. The year closes, opens, and closes again. In such repetition, humans found something stronger than memory alone. They found a sacred clock, immense and silent, moving above every house, field, grave, and fire. A stone, sky, field, house, animal, and ancestor gather into one wider sacred pattern. The old powers begin to change again. They do not yet belong to empires. They do not yet sit in written pantheons, where one god commands the storm, another guards the dead, another protects grain, another rules the sun, and another blesses kings. But something like that future is beginning to take shape. Villages grow larger. Some settlements last for generations. Trade carries obsidian, shells, pigments, tools, ornaments, and ideas across long distances. People no longer know only the small circle of their own hearth and seasonal path. They encounter strangers, neighbouring groups, rivals, marriage partners, traders, migrants, and enemies. In that wider human world, spirits and sacred forces may also begin to grow wider. A household ancestor is powerful inside a family. A spring spirit may matter most to those who drink from that spring. A hunting animal may belong to one group's stories more than another's. But as communities expand and connect, local powers can be shared, compared, merged, or ranked. A protective ancestor may become a founder of a whole settlement. A dangerous storm power may become important to several villages that depend on the same rains. A fertility figure may no longer belong only to one household's private rites, but to communal ceremonies of planting, birth, herd increase, and harvest. The sacred becomes social on a larger scale because society itself has become larger. This is not a simple march from spirits to gods, as if every culture follows the same staircase. Scholars still debate how best to describe the long transition from prehistoric ritual to the named divinities of early states, and the evidence remains incomplete. Some societies may have kept flexible spirit worlds for millennia without turning them into rigid pantheons. Others may have developed powerful divine figures before cities emerged. Some may have imagined the sacred more as a network of ancestors, places, and forces than as individual gods with personalities. But in many regions, as settlements grow and authority becomes more organized, divine powers seem to become more defined, more public, and more capable of supporting claims over land, labor, and leadership. Authority is the hidden thread. In a small group, ritual knowledge may be shared or held by elders, healers, hunters, or specialists whose influence depends on skill and trust. In a larger village, differences can sharpen. Some households may control better land, more animals, more stored grain, more ornaments, more exchange connections, or more remembered ancestors. Some people may become known as ritual experts who can interpret omens, preserve calendars, conduct ceremonies, prepare the dead. Bless fields or speak for powers others fear. The gods before kingdoms may have grown not only from awe, but from the need to organize belief across unequal communities. This does not mean religion was invented as manipulation. That would be too narrow and too modern. The people who performed rites likely believed in their importance. A harvest ceremony could feed social authority and still express genuine fear of hunger. A leader could gain prestige from hosting a feast and still feel real obligation toward ancestors or unseen powers. A shrine could mark political control and still be a place of grief, healing, and hope. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Sacred authority works because it speaks to practical need and emotional truth at the same time. It tells people when to gather, how to mourn, where to place offerings, who belongs, who remembers correctly, and what dangers must be respected. Feasting may have been one of the great engines of this transformation. To feed many people is to display abundance, but also to create debt and unity. A feast can celebrate a successful hunt, a harvest, a marriage, a burial, the building of a monument, the closing of a ritual space, or the turning of the year. It brings people into one place, fills them with shared food, and ties memory to taste, smell, smoke, and song, animal bones, broken vessels, special deposits, and traces of a large gathering suggest that prehistoric feasts could be socially powerful events. What survives in the record suggests that food was never merely food. It was a way to turn stored life into relationship. At such gatherings, gods or proto-gods could grow larger. A spirit honored privately by one family may become known to visitors. A story told by one group may be reshaped as it travels. A carved animal or standing stone may become a symbol recognized by many. Over generations, repeated ceremonies can create a shared sacred grammar. Certain animals appear again and again. Certain gestures return. Certain places gain prestige. Certain people claim to know the correct order of events. What began as local presence becomes tradition, and tradition becomes authority. Trade adds another force. Obsidian from volcanic regions appears far from its source in many prehistoric contexts, showing that exchange networks could reach across impressive distances. Shells travel inland. Rare stones move between communities. Along with objects come stories, styles, marriages, techniques, songs, and perhaps divine names or sacred images. When people exchange valuable materials, they may also exchange the meanings attached to them. A stone from a distant mountain can carry the prestige of that mountain. A shell from the sea can bring the far horizon into an inland village. A pigment from a special source can become more than colour. It becomes proof that the world is larger than the local valley, and that sacred power may also travel. Images begin to standardize in some places. Repeated symbols, repeated figurine styles, repeated arrangements of bodies and objects can suggest shared meanings across communities, but standardization should not be exaggerated. Similar objects do not always mean identical beliefs. A seated figure in one village may be an ancestor, in another a protective being, in another a teaching object, in another a ritual tool whose meaning shifts with context. The evidence remains incomplete. Still, repetition matters. When forms recur across space and time, they show that people are not making meaning from nothing each time. They are inheriting visual languages, even if we cannot translate them fully. This is the world just before the gods become historical. Not a world without religion, but a world where religion is still largely nameless to us. Sacred powers are becoming more public, more connected to settlement identity, more involved in food production, ancestry, exchange, and emerging rank. The storm is becoming more than weather. The mother-like figure is becoming more than a body. The ancestor is becoming more than a family memory. The animal is becoming more than a hunted presence. Each can expand into something larger when more people agree to gather around it. The first kingdoms will later give these powers names, temples, offerings, myths, and official roles. But those kingdoms do not create the sacred from emptiness. They inherit a deep reservoir. Beneath every early city, God stands a much older shadow, the household dead, the dangerous animal, the fertile earth, the returning sun, the spring from underground, the feast that binds strangers, the stone that marks a gathering place. Before gods served kings, they served memory, fear, food, birth, death, and belonging. And in the long dawn before written history, as villages brighten with hearth smoke and fields spread outward from houses, the sacred is already learning how to become political, not yet with crowns, armies, and palace scribes, but with calendars, feasts, ancestors, stored grain, and the quiet power of those who can say where the community came from, what the powers demand, and why the future depends on remembering. When writing finally appears, it does not open a clear window onto the beginning. It opens much later, after thousands of years of memory have already shifted, broken, merged, and been remade. Clay tablets, carved inscriptions, temple lists, hymns, royal monuments, and myths give the first gods their names, but by then the oldest sacred world is already ancient beyond recovery. The scribes of early cities do not record the first moment humans feared the storm, honoured the dead, painted animals in darkness, or marked a spring as powerful. They inherit those things through traditions already layered by countless generations. Writing preserves, but it also freezes. It catches a flowing river at one bend and makes later readers mistake that bend for the source. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, the Indus region, China, and many other early centres of complex society, the gods enter written history as if they already belong there. They have temples, offerings, priestly personnel, festivals, sacred objects, myths, and political roles. They protect cities, they grant kingship, they send floods, fertility, victory, disease, warning dreams, and omens. They are named, praised, feared, and organised. But beneath their official forms, older patterns still show through. The storm god carries the memory of rain as survival and thunder as terror. The grain goddess, or dying vegetation power, carries the old drama of seed, burial, and return. The underworld deity carries the unanswered question of where the dead have gone. The bull, serpent, bird, lion, and wild mountain creature remain close to divine power because animals had been sacred long before cities learned to write. This is why the earliest written religions often feel both sophisticated and strangely old. They are not simple inventions of urban priests. They are city-shaped arrangements of much older human concerns. A temple may stand in mud-brick grandeur, but the power inside it may still be tied to water rising from below, the cycle of the field, the bones of ancestors, the danger of wild beasts, or the sky's reliable turning. What survives in the record suggests that early states gathered older sacred fragments and reorganized them into systems useful for cities, kings, calendars, and law. The gods became more official, but they did not become less ancient. Writing, however, remembers poorly when it comes to deep origins. It favours the concerns of those who write. Scribes record offerings owed to temples, royal devotion, myths that justify power, rituals performed by specialists, and divine genealogies that make sense within literate culture. They rarely preserve the quiet household gestures, the half-remembered village rites, the local spring customs, the old animal taboos, or the meanings of figurines already older than the cities themselves. The evidence remains incomplete because writing does not record all belief equally. It records what institutions need, what elites value, what rituals require administration, and what myths have become important enough to standardize. This creates a strange distortion. The moment gods become visible to history is also the moment they become entangled with bureaucracy. A deity who may once have been a local storm power becomes a patron of kings. A fertility presence becomes part of temple economy. An ancestral force becomes linked to dynastic legitimacy. A sacred animal becomes an emblem on a seal, a carved guardian, a divine attribute, or a royal symbol. The old intimacy is not gone, but it is filtered through institutions. The god now has storehouses, servants, lands, offerings, and a place in official lists. The sacred becomes countable. Yet the older world keeps leaking through, in myths of creation from mud, clay, blood, breath, or earth. One can hear echoes of the ancient recognition that life emerges from matter touched by hidden force. In stories of gods descending into the underworld and returning, one can feel the deep agricultural rhythm of seed and burial. In sacred bulls, lion guardians, serpent powers, eagle forms, and horned deities, the animal imagination of prehistory remains alive, in ancestor cults, royal tombs, and offerings to the dead. The first grief-born powers continue to stand near the living. In temple mountains and sacred high places, the old charged landscape rises into architecture. No single explanation fully accounts for all these continuities, but the pattern is unmistakable. Written religion is built over a much older foundation. Sometimes later myths preserve fragments without understanding them fully. A god may carry an animal companion whose original meaning is lost. A ritual may be performed because it has always been performed, even after the story explaining it has changed. A festival may mark a seasonal turning whose practical importance began in farming, while later theology gives it a grander cosmic explanation. A sacred stone may be housed inside a temple long after people forget why that stone, rather than another, first mattered. Religions are not designed from a clean beginning. They accumulate. They inherit objects, gestures, songs, prohibitions, fears, and local memories, then explain them anew. This is especially clear in the way later civilizations often absorb older gods rather than erase them. A local goddess becomes an aspect of a greater goddess. A village storm power becomes identified with a national god. A mountain spirit is folded into a pantheon. A spring becomes sacred to a named deity whose cult arrives later. A household protector becomes a minor divine figure under a larger theology. Such transformations are not always peaceful or simple, and scholars still debate many cases, but the process is common enough to reveal something important. The gods of history often wear masks made from older gods. The problem is that writing makes those masks look like faces. Once a name is written, it feels fixed. Once a myth is copied, it feels authoritative. Once a temple stands for centuries, it feels original. But behind the name may be a long chain of earlier forms. The storm god of a kingdom may descend from many unnamed storms feared by many villages. The mother goddess of a city may gather memories of birth charms, household figurines, field fertility, and ancestral women. The underworld ruler may stand on thousands of years of burial rites, red ochre, grave goods, skulls, and dreams of the dead. The written god is clear because writing has sharpened the outline, but the source remains blurred. This blurring should not disappoint us. It is part of the truth. The forgotten gods worshipped before history began were not waiting neatly to become the gods of Sumer, Egypt, Greece, or any later world. They were local, shifting, embodied, seasonal, and deeply tied to lived experience. Writing did not simply preserve them, it translated them into the language of cities. Some meanings survived, others were simplified, others were replaced. Others remained hidden in symbols no scribe bothered to explain because everyone at the time thought they already knew. And so when the first written myths speak of heaven and earth, flood and grain, death and return, divine animals and ancestral kings, they are not beginning the story. They are remembering it poorly, beautifully, and incompletely. Beneath the polished temple hymn lies the handprint on the cave wall. Beneath the god list lies the nameless power of thunder over a field. Beneath the royal tomb lies the first body coloured with red earth. History gives the gods voices, but prehistory gives them depth. The written record is not the dawn of belief. It is the first long shadow cast by a sacred world already old. The first written gods arrive with names, but the oldest powers remain nameless. That is the central wound in the story. Archaeology can show where people went, what they carried, what they built, what they buried, what they painted, and sometimes even how they moved through darkness. It can reveal a lamp left in a cave, a skull reshaped with plaster, a figurine broken and discarded, a stone pillar carved with animals, a burial stained with red ochre, a monument aligned toward the returning sun. But it cannot make the dead explain themselves. The most important words are missing. The chant is gone. The gesture's meaning is gone. The name spoken before the offering has vanished into air so completely that even the shape of the language may be lost. This is what makes prehistoric religion so powerful and so dangerous to interpret. The objects survive, but the sentences around them do not. A painted bison may be prey, spirit, ancestor, mythic beast, teaching image, memory of a hunt, clan marker, trance vision, or several things at once. A figurine may be a goddess, a charm, a toy, an ancestor, a body ideal, a ritual tool, or an object whose category no longer exists. A skull beneath a floor may represent reverence, fear, inheritance, grief, property, protection, or the simple insistence that the dead remain part of the household. Scholars still debate these meanings because the evidence remains incomplete, and because human symbols rarely have only one function even in societies that can explain themselves. Modern interpretation often wants certainty faster than the evidence can provide it. One generation sees hunting magic everywhere. Another sees fertility goddesses. Another sees shamans, trance, social identity, ancestor cults, calendars, or political organization. Each interpretation may catch part of the truth in some places, but no single explanation fully accounts for the variety of prehistoric ritual evidence. The danger is not imagination itself. Imagination is necessary. Because archaeology without imagination becomes a catalogue of stones and bones. The danger is forgetting where imagination begins. A careful reconstruction must keep known facts, reasonable inference, and unsupported fantasy separate, even when the fantasy feels beautiful. This is especially important because the silence of prehistory has often attracted myths of its own. People have imagined lost universal religions, secret priesthoods, vanished mother goddess civilizations, ancient astronauts, worldwide cults of forgotten wisdom, and other ideas that say more about modern longing than ancient evidence. These theories can be seductive because they give the missing names back too easily. They turn uncertainty into a story with clean edges. But deep prehistory was not one hidden book waiting to be decoded. It was thousands of communities across immense spans of time, adapting to different climates, animals, landscapes, and dangers. Some may have shared symbols, some may have exchanged ideas, some may have imagined the sacred in ways that would be mutually recognizable. Others may have differed profoundly. To make them all worship the same forgotten god is to erase the very richness that makes the evidence compelling. The problem of missing names also reminds us that writing is not the same as thought. For a long time, people treated prehistory as a shadowy waiting room before real civilization began. But the caves, burials, figurines, monuments, tools, ornaments, and settlements show minds working with memory, beauty, danger, and abstraction long before written history. The absence of text does not mean the absence of story. It means the stories were held in bodies, places, songs, kinship lines, seasonal gatherings and repeated practices. They were strong enough to guide action, but fragile enough to vanish when the last person who knew them died. Oral tradition can preserve astonishing depth, but it changes as it moves. A story told at a hearth is shaped by the teller, the audience, the crisis of the moment, and the needs of the group. A ritual performed for generations may keep its structure while its explanation shifts. A place may remain sacred after the original reason is forgotten. A symbol may outlive the myth that gave it birth. This means that even before writing, the oldest gods may already have been layered with older and newer meanings. Prehistory was not static. A cave image could be revisited by people who no longer understood it exactly as its makers did, yet still felt its power. A burial ground could gather new rites as generations passed. A pillar could be buried, remembered, forgotten, and then become part of a mound whose meaning changed again. Archaeologists work against this loss with patient methods. They study layers of soil, microscopic traces, pigments, residues, tool marks, wear patterns, animal bones, pollen, seeds, isotopes, DNA, settlement layouts, and the relation of objects to one another. A figurine found in a house tells a different story from one found in a grave or a fuse pit. A skull carefully plastered is not the same as a skull casually displaced. A deposit repeated in the same kind of place across many houses may suggest a shared practice. Burn marks, broken edges, cut marks, and traces of handling can reveal whether an object was used, displayed, cooked, worn, damaged, repaired, or deliberately destroyed. The sacred leaves fingerprints, even when it leaves no vocabulary. Yet even the best methods meet a boundary. Science can identify ochre as iron oxide, trace the source of obsidian, date charcoal, reconstruct diet, measure ancient climate, and reveal kinship through DNA. It can show that people gathered, moved, traded, buried, painted, feasted, and built. It cannot tell us with certainty what a mother whispered over a child during a fever, what a hunter felt before touching a painted animal, what name was given to the storm, or whether a carved bird was a spirit, a sign, a memory, or something in between. The lost inner life of prehistory is not a failure of scholarship, it is the condition of the evidence. This condition demands a different kind of respect. The nameless gods should not be forced into tidy modern boxes, but they should not be dismissed as unknowable nothingness either. Between certainty and ignorance lies a wide territory of careful possibility. We can say that people marked certain places with unusual effort. We can say they treated some bodies with deliberate care after death. We can say they gave attention to animals, fertility, fire, sky, stone, and season. We can say they gathered for acts that exceeded immediate survival. We can say their world was meaningful in ways that crossed the visible and invisible. What we cannot honestly say is exactly what every act meant to those who performed it. The missing names may be the most truthful part of the whole story. They remind us that the past is not ours to possess completely. It can be approached, studied, dated, compared, and imagined with discipline, but not conquered. The forgotten gods remain partly hidden because they belong to voices, breaths, and memories that were never meant for us. Their silence is not empty. It is a boundary, like the wall of a cave before the lamp is lit. We can see the animal shape emerge for a moment. We can feel the old presence gather, then the flame shifts, and the meaning withdraws again into stone. Beneath the named gods of history, older shapes continue to breathe. They are not always visible at first, because later religion covers them with temples, myths, priesthoods, sacred books, royal claims, and polished images of divine order. But if the surface is watched carefully, the older patterns return again and again. The animal beside the god, the ancestor beneath the house, the holy mountain behind the temple, the spring that heals, the stone no one moves. The feast at the turning of the year, the burial facing light, the fear of night, the belief that the dead remain close, the hope that life can return after disappearing into darkness. These are the gods beneath the gods, the deep roots of sacred imagination that began long before history knew how to write a divine name. Later civilizations often appear to begin with clarity. A city has a patron deity, a king claims divine favor, a temple stores offerings, a myth explains how the world was made. But under that clarity lies a much older human habit of making relationship with forces that cannot be fully controlled. Agriculture gives the storm god a throne, but the terror of thunder is older than farming. Kingdoms give ancestor cults official form, but grief beside a body is older than kings. Temples place sacred animals in carvings and processions, but the animal gaze in firelit darkness is older than temples. A written underworld has gates, judges, rivers, and names, but the question of where the dead have gone begins the first time someone kneels beside a silent body and cannot accept that the person has entirely vanished. This is the legacy of the forgotten gods before history. They survive not because one continuous prehistoric religion secretly passes unchanged into later ages, but because human beings keep meeting the same great conditions of existence. Birth remains strange, Death remains unacceptable. Storms remain powerful. Animals remain uncanny. Dreams remain vivid. Fire remains comforting and dangerous. The sky remains rhythmic. The earth remains the place where seed and body disappear. Water still rises from hidden places. Darkness still changes the mind. Even when societies transform beyond recognition, these conditions remain, and religion repeatedly returns to them for images, fears, explanations, and rituals. That is why the same motifs appear across cultures that are otherwise very different. Horned powers, bird messengers, serpent beings, mother figures, sacred mountains, underworld journeys, ancestor offerings, solar turnings, lunar cycles, ritual meals, burial goods, protective household spirits, and dangerous wilderness beings appear in many parts of the world. This does not prove that all religions come from one lost universal cult. Such a claim would go far beyond the evidence. Scholars still debate the relationships among independent invention, cultural exchange, shared human psychology, and inherited deep traditions. The evidence remains incomplete, but the recurrence itself is meaningful. It suggests that human sacred imagination repeatedly grows from the same soil dependence: fear, memory, hunger, wonder, and the need to live with uncertainty. Folklore preserves some of these older layers in especially quiet ways. A rural custom of leaving food for the dead, a warning not to disturb a spring, a belief that certain trees are inhabited, a festival fire lit at a seasonal turning, a story of animals who once spoke, a fear that crossroads, thresholds, wells, caves, and graveyards are places where the ordinary world thins. Many such customs are recorded only in much later periods, and they cannot be traced directly back to the Paleolithic or Neolithic with confidence. Yet they show how durable certain sacred instincts can be. People continue to sense that some places are not neutral. A doorway is not just a gap in a wall, a grave is not just a hole in the ground, a well is not just water, a winter fire is not just heat. These meanings may change, but the habit of meaning remains. The earliest gods may therefore be forgotten in name, but not entirely lost in form. They are present whenever later religions imagine divine power as animal, ancestor, mother, storm, sun, moon, underworld, mountain, hearth, or grain. They are present when a temple rises over a place already sacred before the temple existed. They are present when a saint takes over the spring of an older local spirit, when a festival absorbs an older seasonal rite, when a household charm survives beneath a grand theology, when a myth gives a new explanation to an act so old no one remembers its first reason. Religion is often less like a building constructed from fresh stone than like a city built over earlier cities, each layer sinking into the next. The human mind also carries older layers. Even in a modern room, with electric light and sealed windows, darkness can still feel occupied, a storm can still silence conversation, a dream of the dead can still feel like a visit, however one explains it afterward. A landscape can still feel charged by memory. A child can still press a hand into wet sand, mud, or paint and feel the power of leaving a mark. Museums can place ancient figurines behind glass, but their small bodies still draw people close. Cave paintings can be photographed, dated, analysed, and reproduced, but the animal forms still seem to gather presence when seen in the uneven light of the place where they were made. Scientific understanding does not erase wonder. It clarifies the boundary between what is known and what remains mysterious. That boundary may be the true home of the forgotten gods. Not ignorance, but uncertainty filled with attention. Prehistoric people did not live in an empty world, and neither do we, though we often use different language for what moves us. They saw power in animals because animals held survival and danger. They honoured the dead because love and memory did not end cleanly at death. They watched the sky because time itself was written there. They marked caves, houses, stones, and bodies because meaning needed places to live. Their gods are forgotten because their names were carried by breath, not ink, but their questions remain beneath civilization like buried fire. So the story does not end with disappearance, it ends with depth. The named gods of history stand above older shadows, and those shadows stand above still older gestures, a hand on stone, red earth on bone, a fire carried into darkness, a seed covered with soil, a body lowered into the ground, a face remembered by those who cannot bear to let it go. Before history began, humans were already doing what humans have always done. They were trying to answer the world with signs of their own. They were trying to live with powers greater than themselves. They were trying to make the darkness speak back. And now the great noise of the story begins to soften. The caves grow quiet again. The fires burn low. The painted animals remain where they have always remained, fixed in stone and yet never entirely still. Outside, the old rivers continue their work, cutting valleys, carrying silt, reflecting stars that have watched every vanished camp, village, shrine, field, and city pass beneath them. The people who first gave meaning to those places are gone beyond recovery. Their languages have disappeared. Their songs have no sound left in the world. Their gods have no names that can be spoken with certainty, but the traces are enough to leave a shape in the mind. A handprint on a cave wall is not a doctrine. A burial stained red is not a scripture. A carved animal on a pillar is not a hymn. Yet each one says that human life was never only practical, never only hunger and shelter and tool-making. Even in the deep past, people stopped before mystery. They made marks where marks were not needed. They carried the dead with care. They watched the sky return to its appointed places. They built memory into stone, earth, fire, and bone. They lived close to the fragile edge where fear becomes reverence and survival becomes meaning. The forgotten gods worshipped before history began may never come back to us as they were. Perhaps they should not. Their silence protects them from being made too simple. They remain partly hidden, like animals inside the cave wall before the lamp passes over them. For a moment, the form appears, a shoulder, a horn, a lifted head, a human hand, a face restored in plaster, a stone standing under the sun. Then the light moves, and certainty fades. But something lingers. It lingers in the way people still gather at graves, still mark seasons, still tell stories about the dead, still feel awe beneath mountains and stars, still look into darkness and imagine presence there. Civilizations rise over these instincts, name them, organize them, argue over them, and sometimes forget where they began. Yet beneath all that, the older current continues, quietly, patiently, like water under stone. It carries the first human questions forward. And in the final image, there is only a cave wall, a low flame, and the outline of a hand left by someone who could not know that thousands of generations later, another human mind would pause before it and feel, across all that distance, that the darkness was never empty.